So in this video, we're going to talk about a topic that crops up frequently on our forums, questions I get through the website, and also on this channel, and that is storing a car. How do you store a car? The common conception and understanding is that cars deteriorate more quickly when they're not used. So there's probably arguments for and against that assertion or that statement, but there is a lot of truth in the fact that cars do deteriorate more quickly when they're not being used. But obviously, if they're being used in a wrong way or a rough way, that will obviously outweigh the deterioration that happens with a car just sitting there. So let's just look at what we should do to a car that's going to be sitting there for some time. Now, we may have an extended holiday. We may be called up overseas for some reason or other. We may just have a project car and it's not quite on the road, so we just need to keep it locked up for maybe over the winter or until our funds have been restored and we can actually go out there and start taking the bits off and replacing them and getting it roadworthy again. So your biggest enemy is rust. Now, rust requires moisture or water in order to start forming. So the best thing we can do really when we're storing our car is to wash it completely, because bits of dirt will trap moisture and that can accelerate the rust forming. You'll notice that rust often forms in areas of the car where water is able to collect. So that's often through little seams, plastic covers, plastic trims, that sort of thing. Anywhere where the water can get in there and sit is a hot spot for rust to form. So wash the car before you store it. Now, you don't want to store it wet. You need to make sure that the car is as dry as possible before you start storing it. So take it out for a run, use a scrim on it, make sure that the car is dry. And now it's ready for long-term storage. You've got none of these areas that are going to accelerate rust spots forming because they're damp or there's dirt there that's trapping the moisture. So if you can store the car inside a garage, better still if it's a heated garage or you have a dehumidifier, you can reduce the moisture content in the air substantially, further reducing the risk of rust forming on the car. Some people also recommend applying a protective coating of wax to the car before it goes into storage. So there's certainly merits in that. This layer of wax will prevent the moisture and the water from getting into the paintwork where rust can start to form. It's not just outside the car that you need to worry about rust forming, it's inside the car as well, particularly the engine. The engine effectively is a metal block. The components inside the engine are made of metal. So with the moisture in the atmosphere, it will condense on these cold metal components. So that will cause areas of moisture on the metal accelerating deterioration and you'll get rust spots forming. So some people recommend spraying a little bit of oil inside the engine, removing the spark plugs and just spraying a little oil on the cylinders. That just helps to form a bit of a barrier to protect the cylinders and the pistons against this corrosion that can form inside the engine. But it's usually much easier to just run the engine a little bit, to let the engine circulate the oil periodically and keep everything lubricated and coated inside the engine. Now, you want to avoid these little short bursts of idling. You want the car to get up to temperature each time you start it. So that may involve putting a little bit of load on the throttle or even taking it out for a drive. But if your car's in storage and not legal, that's probably not an option. So you're looking to do this while it's in storage. How often should you do that? Well, it depends a lot on the engine, the way it's being stored, and how quickly you're going to get back to it to get it back on the road again. So unfortunately, I haven't got an answer for that one. You certainly want to keep the car turning over regularly. So for most people, that's once a month. For others, it's going to be once a week. But again, even your climate will have a bearing on how often you need to start it and run the engine. Another thing that often happens is things start nesting in the car, particularly the exhaust. The exhaust pipe looks appetizing to mice and rats. So the recommendation there is just to stick a rag in the tailpipe just to prevent anything from nesting inside the car. It's a big hassle to deal with vermin and rodents that have got inside the exhaust system. They can cause absolute chaos and just pack the exhaust with all their nesting materials, and that's also a potential fire risk. So just stick a few rags in the back. If you've done that though, leave yourself a note on the dashboard to remind you to remove the rags when you start the car, or you're going to have an interesting time when that first starts up. So after a while of sitting there, the brake pads are going to start binding to the brake disc. So you don't really want the handbrake on applying the brake brake pad all the time. It's better to just shock the wheels to stop the car from moving around, perhaps even leaving it in gear just to prevent the car from moving while it's in storage. So that will go a long way to protecting the brakes and prevent them from binding on, because that's quite expensive to replace the discs and the pads just because they've rusted together and formed a solid lump. The other thing that suffers when a car's in storage is the tyres, because all the pressure is on one part of the tyre, and the overall inflation of a tyre will decrease over time. That every tyre loses air. That's just the nature of what they are. You're eventually going to be dealing with flats. You want to make sure that those tyre pressures are at or slightly above the recommended pressure for your car when you're storing it. And it's also a good idea just to put the car on axle stands so the weight is not resting on this single point on the tyres. If you haven't got axle stands, it's a good idea to just rotate the wheels slightly so there's a different part of the tyre in contact with the weight of the car and the ground, so that spreads out the wear and tear on these tyres over a period of time. Other things that can happen is the wiper blades can stick to the glass, and that can make the glass really messy. It can wreck the wiper blades. So a rag or a piece of grease-proof paper, baking film, even tin foil has been used in some instances, and it just underneath the wiper stops that from forming that link to the glass. So at the very least, you may have to replace the wipers if they've deteriorated, but you're not going to be dealing with all the residue that's bonded to the glass. Now, when a car is just sitting there, you've got the clock, the car alarm, the ancillary systems. So modern cars seem to have a bigger parasitic drain on the battery than older cars. You can prevent that from happening by disconnecting the battery. Just disconnect the earth. The battery is going to last a lot longer with charge in it. So a lot of people will recommend you charge it to about 80% when you're storing it. Others say you've got to charge it fully up when you're storing it, but you certainly want to keep some charge in the battery. And the best way of doing that is to just disconnect it from the car so it's not being drained all the time, and just reconnect it when you want to start the car, and just check the battery charge levels, top that up. Now, if you're storing it through winter, you're probably dealing with some pretty cold temperatures as well. So you want to make sure that the antifreeze is topped up so the car is protected against freezing. The last thing you want is the coolant inside the engine block to start expanding. They do have core plugs that will pop out and protect the engine to some degree from this. But again, you're dealing with a frustration of having to fix a car when just checking the antifreeze strength before you stored it would have gone a long way to mitigating that cost. So other things to think about is anything in the car that moves. So the windows go up and down, they'll eventually just seize up if they're not used for extended periods of time. So just make sure the windows are wound down and back up periodically while the car is in storage. That also applies to the steering. So just changing the lock on the steering to full right and full left, that'll give the steering pump and the entire steering mechanism a little bit of a workout and just prevent that from seizing up. But cars have a lot of rubber and plastic components which will degrade over time. So your car may well have been in perfect condition when it was stored, but because of the deterioration of these rubber parts, you may see leaks. Your suspension may start to creak or rattle or bump, and you may not have the smooth motion of those suspension components that you had when the car first went into storage. So depending on how long, you may well have to just go out and bite the bullet, replace some of these rubber components so that any deterioration is not going to affect your enjoyment of the car. So another thing to bear in mind when storing a car is the fact that fuel goes off. So after 12 months, there are problems associated with that old fuel. So at that point, you need to drain the tank and refill it. With diesel fuels, the problems happen a bit sooner. So after 6 months, there's evidence of bacterial growth within the fuel itself, and that can clog fuel pumps. It can clog up the injectors and cause other issues. So when you store in a car, bear in mind that that fuel is going to go off. Drain the tank down or fill the tank up completely to stop moisture filling in. So we've got two completely conflicting pieces of information there. But the recommendation that I personally follow is to keep the fuel as low as possible, and then when you come to recommission the vehicle, top the fuel tank right up, so there's a predominance of new fuel in there, and that should dilute down any of the problems associated with that old fuel. I've done another video that goes into the detail of fuel and its degradation, so if you're interested in learning a bit more about that and some of the additives that you can add to your fuel tank to prolong the life of that fuel that's being stored along with the car, check out that video. I'll put a note in the comments below and I'll try and link it at the end of this video as well for you. So thanks for watching. Please boot that like button, that really does help us to get out there. And I've lined this video and this playlist up for you that you should find really interesting, so see you in this next video.